By the 4th century BCE, beyond the settled empires of Persia, a mobile society was forming on the Eurasian frontier, one that would later confront Rome and alter the balance of power across the ancient world. The northeastern Iranian plateau and the Central Asian steppe formed a transitional zone between sedentary agricultural civilizations and nomadic pastoral societies during the early 1st millennium BCE. This region, extending east of the Caspian Sea toward the Oxus River, was characterized by arid plains, seasonal pastures, and limited permanent settlement. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with the Yaz culture, dated roughly between 1500 and 500 BCE, indicates the presence of early Indo-Iranian communities engaged in mixed subsistence strategies, combining limited agriculture with pastoral mobility. Further east, the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, though earlier in date, provides additional context for the development of settled societies that influenced later steppe populations through trade and cultural exchange. These interconnected zones created a frontier environment where mobility, adaptation, and interaction defined long-term patterns of life. Within this broader context emerged the Dahi, a confederation of nomadic tribes occupying territories along the southeastern shores of the Caspian Sea. Classical sources, particularly those of Greek and Roman authors, provide the primary written references to these groups. Strabo, writing in the early 1st century CE, describes the Dahi as a collection of tribes known for their mobility and reliance on mounted warfare. Among these groups were the Parni, a smaller tribal unit whose historical significance would only become apparent in later centuries. The Parni likely spoke an Eastern Iranian language and shared cultural affinities with other steppe populations, including traditions of clan-based leadership and seasonal migration. The environmental conditions of the steppe played a decisive role in shaping Parni society. Limited rainfall and sparse vegetation required constant movement to sustain herds of horses and livestock. This mobility fostered a decentralized social structure, in which authority rested within kinship groups rather than centralized institutions. Leadership was often situational, emerging in times of conflict or migration, rather than institutionalized through permanent administrative systems. Archaeological evidence, including burial mounds and material remains associated with nomadic cultures, supports the existence of stratified but flexible social hierarchies, where elite warriors held prominence but did not exercise absolute control over large, fixed populations. By the 6th century BCE, much of the Iranian plateau had been incorporated into the Achaemenid Empire. However, the steppe regions to the northeast remained only loosely connected to imperial authority. Achaemenid inscriptions, such as those of Darius I, reference various nomadic groups on the empire's periphery, indicating awareness but limited control. The Dahi and related tribes likely engaged in intermittent interactions with Achaemenid officials, including trade, tribute, and occasional military service. However, the logistical challenges of governing highly mobile populations in geographically vast and environmentally harsh regions meant that direct administration was minimal. As a result, the Parni and their neighbors maintained a degree of autonomy even during periods of imperial expansion. The campaigns of Alexander III of Macedon in the late 4th century BCE brought significant political changes to the region. Following the defeat of the Achaemenid Empire around 330 BCE, Alexander's forces advanced into Central Asia, establishing garrisons and founding cities intended to secure his eastern territories. Greek sources document resistance from local populations, particularly in regions such as Sogdiana and Bactria, where guerrilla tactics and knowledge of the terrain challenged Macedonian control. While there is limited direct evidence of Parni involvement in these conflicts, the broader disruption of established political structures likely affected all groups in the region. The imposition of Hellenistic rule introduced new administrative centers and economic networks, but it did not fundamentally alter the nomadic lifestyle of steppe populations. Following Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his empire fragmented, and the eastern territories came under the control of the Seleucid dynasty. The Seleucid Empire inherited the challenge of governing vast and diverse lands, including the frontier zones inhabited by the Dahi and Parni. Administrative efforts focused primarily on urban centers and agriculturally productive regions, leaving the steppe largely beyond effective control. Seleucid authority in these areas was therefore indirect, relying on local intermediaries and occasional military expeditions rather than sustained governance. This created a persistent gap between imperial ambitions and practical control, particularly in the northeastern satrapies. Classical authors provide additional insight into the military practices of steppe groups during this period. Strabo and other writers describe the use of composite bows, lightweight armor, and highly mobile cavalry units. These tactics were well suited to the open terrain of the steppe, where speed and maneuverability provided significant advantages over heavier, infantry-based forces. The Parni, as part of this broader cultural and military tradition, would have developed expertise in mounted archery and rapid movement across large distances. This mode of warfare was not only a response to environmental conditions but also a defining feature of steppe societies, shaping their interactions with neighboring states. The socio-political organization of the Parni remained rooted in tribal structures throughout this period. Kinship ties formed the basis of cohesion, with extended families and clans functioning as the primary units of organization. Decision-making processes were likely collective to some extent, involving councils of elders or leading warriors. While this system lacked the kindred authority of settled empires, it provided flexibility and resilience, allowing groups to adapt quickly to changing conditions. The absence of fixed administrative centers also made these societies difficult to subjugate, as control over territory did not equate to control over populations. Archaeological findings from sites such as Nisa, which would later become a significant Parthian center, suggest that the transition from nomadic to more settled forms of organization began gradually. Early phases of occupation indicate a combination of local traditions and external influences, reflecting the complex interactions between steppe populations and neighboring civilizations. Material culture, including ceramics, fortifications, and burial practices, demonstrates both continuity with earlier nomadic traditions and adaptation to new political realities. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the conditions that had long defined the steppe frontier, mobility, decentralization, and limited external control, remained largely intact. However, the weakening of Seleucid authority in the eastern provinces began to create new opportunities for local groups. Internal conflicts within the Seleucid Empire, combined with the challenges of maintaining distant territories, reduced the effectiveness of imperial governance. In this context, frontier populations such as the Parni were increasingly positioned to move beyond their traditional roles as peripheral actors. As Seleucid authority weakened in the eastern satrapies, these frontier groups gained opportunities to expand into settled territories. Before we continue, consider subscribing for more long-form historical documentaries. You can also enable notifications to stay updated with future releases and share your thoughts or key takeaways in the comments below. In 247 BCE, a tribal leader seized a frontier province and founded an empire that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. By the mid-3rd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire faced increasing internal instability across its eastern territories. Following the death of Antiochus II Theos in 246 BCE, a dynastic conflict known as the Third Syrian War disrupted central authority and diverted military resources toward the Western Front. This weakening of imperial control created conditions in which peripheral regions, particularly the satrapies of Parthia and Hyrcania, became vulnerable to local uprisings and external incursions. Classical sources, including the epitome of Pompeius Trogus preserved by Justin, indicate that it was during this period of fragmentation that Arsaces, leader of the Parni, initiated a revolt against Seleucid authority. Arsaces' origins remain partially obscured due to the limited and often retrospective nature of the sources. Greek and Roman authors describe him as a figure of nomadic background, likely emerging from within the Dahi Confederation. His leadership appears to have combined military capability with the ability to unify disparate tribal groups under a common objective. According to Strabo, the Parni had long existed on the margins of settled territories, but their familiarity with both steppe warfare and frontier conditions provided a strategic advantage. The decision to target the satrapy of Parthia was not incidental. It represented a calculated move into a region that was both politically weakened and geographically accessible from the steppe. The initial phase of the revolt likely involved the expulsion or defeat of the Seleucid satrap Andragoras, who had previously declared independence from central authority. Numismatic evidence supports this sequence, as coins attributed to Andragoras cease around the same period that Ars Acid coinage begins to appear. This transition suggests not only a sman of vlasti but also the rapid establishment of a new political order. Ars Aces adopted the title of king, marking a departure from purely tribal leadership and signaling the formation of a dynastic raja. The use of coinage, bearing his name and imagery, indicates an early effort to legitimize authority and communicate sovereignty across the region. Archaeological evidence from Old Nisa, located near modern Ashgabat, provides further insight into the early Ars Acid state. Excavations have uncovered fortifications, storage facilities, and administrative structures dating to the early Parthian period. These findings suggest that Nisa functioned as a of governance and possibly a royal residence. The presence of large storage jars, known as ostraca, inscribed with administrative records, indicates the development of bureaucratic practices adapted to the needs of a growing polity. While the scale of these institutions remained limited compared to earlier empires, they represent a significant shift from the purely nomadic structures of the Parni. Despite this initial success, the newly established Ars Acid state faced immediate challenges. The Seleucid Empire, though weakened, retained the capacity to project military quwwah into its eastern provinces. Antiochus III, who came to power in 223 BCE, launched a campaign to restore Seleucid control over Parthia and neighboring regions. Polybius provides a detailed account of this expedition, describing how Antiochus advanced into Parthian territory and temporarily reasserted dominance. Arsaces II, successor to the founder, was compelled to recognize Seleucid suzerainty, at least nominally, as part of a negotiated settlement. This episode demonstrates that early Parthian independence was neither absolute nor uncontested. However, the ability of the Ars Acid rulers to survive such a daghthu reflects the istimraran of their step-based military system. Unlike the Seleucid armies, which relied heavily on infantry formations and fixed khatuthan of supply, Parthian forces maintained a high degree of mobility. Cavalry units, composed of horse archers and lightly armored riders, could avoid direct confrontation when necessary and exploit weaknesses in enemy positioning. This flexibility allowed the Parthians to endure periods of Kharija pressure without the complete collapse of their Sessa structure. Over time, as Seleucid attention shifted elsewhere, the Ars Acids were able to reassert their autonomy and consolidate their control over the region. The internal organization of the early Ars Acid state retained many features of its tribal origins. Authority was distributed among leading Khenden, each of which controlled its own Naru and territory. The king functioned as a coordinating figure rather than an absolute ruler, relying on alliances and personal loyalty to maintain cohesion. This decentralized system, while potentially unstable, provided a degree of resilience in the face of external threats. It also allowed for the gradual integration of newly acquired territories without the immediate imposition of a rigid administrative framework. Numismatic and textual evidence indicates that the Ars Acids were conscious of the need to position themselves within the broader political landscape of the Hellenistic world. Early Parthian coins often imitated Seleucid styles, including the use of Greek inscriptions and iconography. This adoption of Hellenistic forms served both practical and symbolic purposes, facilitating economic exchange while also signaling continuity with established systems of authority. At the same time, the retention of Iranian titles and cultural elements reflects a dual strategy of adaptation and distinction. The establishment of the Ars Acid dynasty marked a turning point in the history of the region. What began as a localized revolt evolved into a Rajnitic entity capable of enduring repeated challenges. The combination of Stepa-Askariya traditions with emerging administrative practices created a hybrid system that would define Parthian governance for centuries. The early decades of Ars Acid rule were characterized by uncertainty and sangharsh, but they also laid the groundwork for future expansion. By the late 3rd century BCE, the Parthians had secured a sthayi foothold in northeastern Iran. While their control remained mahdudan in scope, the istimraran of their rule demonstrated the viability of their political and military model. The weakening of Seleucid authority, combined with the adaptability of the Ars Acid leadership, allowed the Parthians to transition from a peripheral tribal group to a recognized regional power. With independence secured, the Ars Acid rulers began expanding westward into the former territories of the Seleucid Empire. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Parthians had moved from survival to domination. The reign of Mithridates I, conventionally dated from approximately 171 to 132 BCE, represents a decisive marhala in the transformation of the Parthian state from a Semith regional Siddha into a structured imperial power. Prior to his rule, Ars Acid authority remained largely confined to northeastern Iran, with influence dependent on fluctuating conditions within the Seleucid Empire. By the early 2nd century BCE, however, Seleucid had weakened significantly due to internal dynastic সংঘর্ষ and external pressures, including conflicts in the western provinces and challenges from emerging regional Ilkhuwa. This ajnitic fragmentation created a nuvsur that Mithridates I systematically exploited through coordinated military campaigns and strategic territorial integration. The initial phase of expansion focused on Media, a region of considerable Rajnitic and Arctic importance located to the west of Parthia. Control over Media provided access to established urban centers, Rishi Sansadhan, and key communication routes linking the Iranian plateau with Mesopotamia. Classical accounts, supported by numismatic evidence, indicate that Mithridates advanced into Media during the mid-2nd century BCE, displacing Seleucid Adhikarion and asserting Parthian authority. The capture of Ecbatana, one of the Pramukh administrative centers of the region, marked a significant development, as it symbolized the intikarlan from peripheral Shakti to direct control over Sebukun imperial territories. This Sugyan demonstrated not only military kshamta but also an increasing willingness to engage with sedentary populations and established governance structures. Following the consolidation of Media, Mithridates extended his campaigns into Mesopotamia, targeting the economically vital region of Babylonia. Cuneiform tablets from Babylon provide critical contemporary evidence for this expansion. These administrative records, dated to the mid-2nd century BCE, document the presence of Parthian Adhikarion and the continuation of local bureaucratic practices under Nushasan. The preservation of traditional record-keeping systems suggests that Mithridates did not attempt to dismantle existing administrative frameworks but instead integrated them into Ars Acid rule. This approach allowed for continuity in taxation, land management, and legal processes, reducing the likelihood of Tania resistance while ensuring steady revenue streams. The conquest of Seleucia on the Tigris, one of the largest Hellenistic cities in the region, further reinforced Parthian control over Mesopotamia. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Seleucia remained an important economic and administrative center under Ars Acid rule, although its Rajnitic status evolved over time. The ability to govern such a diverse and urbanized population required significant adaptation on the part of the Parthian leadership. Unlike their earlier Chiran as a nomadic confederation, the Ars Acids now faced the chunauthi of administering fixed territories with complex Samajic hierarchies and Arctic systems. Mithridates I's adoption of the title King of Kings reflects this transition to imperial shasan. This title, previously used by Achaemenid rulers, signaled both continuity with earlier Persian traditions and an assertion of Arvabamic authority over subordinate rulers and regions. Numismatic evidence from his reign supports this claim, with coins bearing inscriptions that emphasize royal legitimacy and Yapuk dominion. The use of Greek language on coinage, combined with Iranian titles and iconography, illustrates a deliberate need of Sanskritic synthesis. This dual representation facilitated interaction with Hellenized urban populations while maintaining connections to Iranian Rajnitic traditions. The incorporation of Elam and other southwestern territories further expanded the geographical scope of the Parthian Empire. These regions, located between the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, served as Mahithwapurn transitional zones, linking different ecological and Arctic kshetram. Control over Elam enhanced access to trade routes extending toward the Persian Gulf, thereby increasing the empire's Arctic integration. Archaeological findings, including settlement patterns and material culture, indicate a gradual process of assimilation rather than abrupt parivartan, with local elites often retaining positions of authority under Ars Acid oversight. The expansion under Mithridates I also had significant implications for long-distance trade. By extending control across key segments of the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, The Parthians positioned themselves along major Vyaparic corridors connecting Central Asia with the Eastern Mediterranean. While the full development of Silk Road networks would occur later, this period marks an early era in the consolidation of transregional exchange systems. Goods such as textiles, metals, and agricultural products moved through Parthian-controlled territories, contributing to increased Rajasv and Arctic stability. The strategic mahitva of these routes would continue to shape Parthian foreign policy and military gatividya in subsequent centuries. The Rajnitic structure of the expanding empire remained characterized by a balance between Indriya authority and regional autonomy. Mithridates appears to have relied on a combination of direct shasan in Kikshetron and indirect control through Staniya elites. This hybrid system allowed for efficient prashasan across diverse kshetron without the need for extensive bureaucratic indrikaran. However, it also required careful management of alliances and loyalties, as regional Shaktiya retained significant influence within their kshetron. This demurran of aristocratic families as pramukh actors within the state reflects the continuity of earlier Samajic structures, even as the scale of shasan increased. Military organization during this period continued to reflect steppe traditions, with an emphasis on cavalry units capable of rapid movement and sustained abhiyan. The integration of these forces with the Sansadhan base of conquered territories enhanced their effectiveness, allowing for longer campaigns and greater territorial nientran. Classical sources, though limited in detail, suggest that Parthian armies under Mithridates were able to operate across varied terrains, adapting their tactics to different paristhithia. This flexibility was a key factor in the success of their expansion. By the end of Mithridates' I's reign, the Parthian state had undergone a fundamental transformation. What had once been a Semit Sattha on the northeastern frontier had become a Visthrith empire encompassing multiple regions, cultures, and Arctic systems. The combination of military expansion, administrative adaptation, and Sanskritic integration created a sthayi foundation for future vikas. The Ars-Acid dynasty, established under Arsaces I, now presided over a Rajnitic entity capable of competing with other major powers of the Hellenistic world. As Parthian territory expanded, the need for stable political organization and cultural integration became increasingly critical. Parthian kings ruled an empire, but not with absolute control. The political structure of the Parthian Empire developed as a hybrid system, combining elements of steppe tribal Sangatun with the administrative legacies of earlier Iranian and Hellenistic states. By the time the Ars-Acid Empire reached its territorial height between the 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE, its shasan extended across regions as diverse as Mesopotamia, Media, and parts of Central Asia. This geographical vistar required a form of governance capable of accommodating varied populations, local traditions, and economic systems. Rather than imposing a centralized bureaucratic model similar to that of the earlier Achaemenid Empire, the Ars-Acid rulers maintained a decentralized framework in which authority was distributed among regional elites and powerful noble families. At the core of this system was the Ars-Acid king, who held the title King of Kings, indicating nominal supremacy over subordinate rulers and kshetron. However, this title did not correspond to absolute Rajnitic authority. Greek and Roman sources, particularly the writings of Tacitus, describe a political vatavaran in which royal power was often constrained by the influence of aristocratic clans. These noble families, including the Surin and Karen houses, controlled significant Aumi, military resources, and regional prashasnik networks. Their samartan was essential for the Raja to maintain stability and enforce decisions across the empire. As a result, governance operated through a continuous process of negotiation between the central monarchy and regional Shaktiya. The prominence of these aristocratic families can be traced to earlier Iranian traditions, where noble lineages played a key role in military organization and territorial administration. In the Parthian context, this structure was reinforced by the absence of a large Gindrikrit bureaucratic apparatus. Instead, local rulers and governors exercised considerable autonomy in managing their kshetron, including taxation, legal matters, and military recruitment. Evidence from inscriptions and coinage indicates that regional authorities often issued their own administrative directives, while still acknowledging the supremacy of the Ars-Acid king. This yavastha allowed for efficient local governance, particularly in kshetron with established urban centers and complex Samajic hierarchies. The city of Ctesiphon, located on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, emerged as one of the Pramukh political centers of the Parthian Empire. Archaeological remains and classical accounts suggest that it functioned as a royal rajdhani, particularly during the later phases of Ars-Acid rule. However, unlike the fixed capitals of more centralized empires, Ctesiphon did not serve as the sole administrative hub. The Parthian court was mobile to some extent, reflecting earlier nomadic traditions, and royal authority was exercised across multiple centers depending on Rajnitic and military paristhithia. This mobility further contributed to the decentralized nature of governance, as it limited the development of a permanent administrative bureaucracy concentrated in a single location. The continuation of satrap-like Prashasnik divisions also reflects the adaptive nature of Parthian Shasan. While the term satrap is more commonly associated with the Achaemenid Empire, similar roles existed under the Ars-Acids, with regional governors overseeing provinces on behalf of the king. However, these officials often came from local elite families rather than being appointed solely by the central authority. This practice reinforced existing power structures while integrating them into the broader imperial framework. Records indicate that such arrangements allowed the Parthians to maintain control over distant kshetron without the need for constant Sana intervention, as local leaders had a vested interest in preserving stability. Despite its flexibility, this decentralized system introduced significant Rajnitic challenges. Succession disputes were a recurring feature of Parthian history, often involving rival claimants supported by different noble factions. Tacitus and other Roman historians describe instances in which aristocratic families played Nirnayak roles in selecting or deposing kings, sometimes inviting external intervention from Rome to support their preferred candidates. These internal sangharsh weakened central authority and occasionally led to periods of fragmentation within the empire. Numismatic evidence, including the simultaneous circulation of coins bearing the names of competing rulers, provides material confirmation of such contested successions. The military structure of the Parthian Empire further illustrates the hierarchy between central authority and noble power. Rather than maintaining a large standing army under direct royal control, the Ars-Acid kings relied on contingents supplied by aristocratic families. Each noble house was responsible for raising and equipping its own kuwetan, particularly cavalry units, which formed the core of Parthian military shakti. This system ensured rapid mobilization in times of conflict but also meant that the king's Sana capabilities were dependent on the loyalty and cooperation of regional elites. In cases where such loyalty was divided, the effectiveness of military campaigns could be compromised. Archaeological findings and material culture provide additional insight into the functioning of this Ajnitic system. Variations in coinage styles, inscriptions, and architectural remains across different kshetrons suggest a high degree of regional diversity within the empire. While royal imagery and titles appeared on coins, local artistic traditions and administrative practices often persisted alongside them. This coexistence of centralized symbols and localized expression reflects the broader structure of Parthian governance, in which unity was maintained through shared Rajnitic identity rather than uniform Prashasnik control. The decentralized nature of Parthian Shasan also influenced its interactions with neighboring powers, particularly Rome. Diplomatic engagements and Sana confrontations often involved not only the king but also regional leaders whose samarthan was critical for coordinated action. Roman sources frequently note the complexity of Parthian decision-making processes, which could delay responses but also allowed for flexible renithia. This structure made the empire less predictable but also more adaptable in the face of external threats. By the 1st century CE, the Parthian Empire had established a durable, though inherently unstable pranali of governance that balanced royal authority with aristocratic power. This arrangement enabled the administration of a vast and diverse territory without the need for kendrikrit niyantran, but it also ensured that internal tensions remained a constant feature of Rajnitic life. The interaction between these competing forces shaped the long-term development of the empire and influenced its ability to respond to both dakhili and external challenges. This political flexibility was mirrored in the cultural and religious diversity that defined the Parthian world. In the Parthian Empire, cultures did not disappear, they merged. Parthian society developed at the intersection of Iranian cultural traditions and the Hellenistic influences inherited from the Seleucid period. The Arsacids ruled over a heterogeneous population that included Iranian highlanders, Mesopotamian urban communities, and Hellenized settlers. Maintaining political stability in such a diverse empire required not only military strength but also a pragmatic approach to cultural and religious administration. Archaeological evidence and classical sources indicate that the Parthians embraced a degree of religious plurality while selectively integrating Hellenistic elements into their art, governance, and public imagery. Zoroastrian practices, with their focus on fire cults, sacred rituals, and ethical cosmology, likely persisted among Iranian populations in the eastern and central regions of the empire. While textual sources from this period are sparse, later Parthian inscriptions and indirect references suggest the continued prominence of traditional Iranian religious concepts. At the same time, local Mesopotamian cults, including those devoted to deities such as Marduk and Nabu, remained influential in urban centers like Babylon and Seleucia. The coexistence of these religious traditions demonstrates the Arsacids' policy of tolerance, which allowed local communities to maintain established practices under imperial oversight. Hellenistic influence, inherited from Seleucid governance, was particularly evident in artistic and architectural domains. Excavations at Nisa, the early royal center of the Parthians, reveal reliefs, statuary, and decorative motifs that blend Greek stylistic conventions with Iranian symbolic elements. Greek techniques, such as naturalistic representation of human figures and architectural orders, were combined with Iranian iconography, including royal regalia, animal symbolism, and motifs drawn from steppe traditions. Similarly, at Hatra, sculptures and temple structures illustrate a syncretic approach to religious and civic art, integrating both Mesopotamian and Hellenistic aesthetics. Parthian coinage provides further insight into this cultural synthesis. Early and mid-Arsacid coins frequently depict rulers in a Hellenistic style, with portraiture reminiscent of Seleucid numismatics, including realistic facial features, draped garments, and diadems. Yet these depictions are often paired with Iranian symbols of kingship, such as the bow, throne imagery, or inscriptions in Middle Iranian scripts. This combination of Hellenistic form and Iranian content served multiple purposes. It projected royal authority in a recognizable visual language to Hellenized subjects, while simultaneously reinforcing indigenous traditions among Iranian populations. Written records from the Parthian period remain limited, but inscriptions and classical accounts provide evidence for the Arsacids' adaptive approach to governance and cultural policy. Greek and Roman authors, including Strabo and Plutarch, comment on the coexistence of multiple religious traditions within the empire, noting the relative tolerance afforded to different communities. Archaeological remains corroborate these observations, suggesting that the Parthians neither imposed religious uniformity nor actively suppressed local cults. Instead, they created a flexible administrative and ceremonial framework that could accommodate diverse beliefs while maintaining loyalty to the monarchy. This cultural pluralism extended beyond religion into language, administration, and social practice. In urban centers, Greek continued to function as the lingua franca for commerce, diplomacy, and legal proceedings, while Iranian languages were prevalent in eastern regions and among tribal populations. Official documents, seals, and inscriptions reflect this dual linguistic environment, demonstrating the practical integration of multiple cultural registers. Similarly, ceremonial practices combined Iranian ritual elements with Hellenistic public forms, such as processions, temple dedications, and courtly ceremonies. The resulting synthesis allowed the Arsacids to govern effectively across a geographically and ethnically diverse empire. The fusion of Iranian and Hellenistic traditions was not merely superficial. It also influenced political legitimacy. By adopting Hellenistic visual and administrative forms, the Arsacids were able to situate themselves within the established framework of Mediterranean imperial authority, which was widely recognized in diplomatic and economic networks. Simultaneously, the retention of Iranian symbols and religious references reinforced their position as successors to the region's indigenous political and cultural lineage. Coins, inscriptions, and architectural projects functioned as tools of symbolic communication, projecting authority across diverse populations without the need for direct cultural enforcement. Artistic and religious synthesis also facilitated the integration of newly acquired territories. As the Parthians expanded westward into Mesopotamia and the former Seleucid domains, they encountered urbanized societies with entrenched Hellenistic institutions and local religious traditions. Rather than attempting to replace existing systems, the Arsacids adapted their approach, incorporating local elites into governance, recognizing established cults, and continuing urban practices. Archaeological surveys indicate that public architecture, temples, and civic spaces often combined Greek forms with indigenous motifs, reflecting both continuity and adaptation. This pragmatic policy strengthened local allegiance while reinforcing the central monarchy's legitimacy. The Parthian approach to cultural synthesis extended to funerary practices as well. Tombs and burial sites often exhibit a combination of steppe, Iranian, and Hellenistic elements, including the placement of grave goods, architectural features, and decorative motifs. Such integration suggests that elite families, in particular, participated in a shared cultural vocabulary that bridged diverse traditions. The ability to accommodate different burial practices without disrupting social cohesion reflects the broader flexibility of the empire's administrative and ideological structures. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Parthian Empire had established a stable framework for cultural and religious coexistence, balancing Iranian traditions with Hellenistic influences. This synthesis allowed the Arsacids to govern a vast territory comprising multiple ecological zones, linguistic communities, and religious practices. The policy of tolerance and adaptability created conditions for enduring stability, enabling the empire to maintain cohesion even as it expanded further into Mesopotamia and beyond. Cultural integration under the Parthians was closely tied to economic networks. Control over trade routes connecting Central Asia, Iran, and Mesopotamia facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and artistic forms, reinforcing the hybridization observed in religious and artistic domains. By combining pragmatic governance with cultural synthesis, the Arsacids created an environment in which local traditions could persist while simultaneously strengthening imperial identity. This dynamic of cultural fusion set the stage for Parthian administrative and economic structures, linking religion, art, and governance to the practical realities of empire building. Between Rome and China, the Parthians controlled the world's most valuable trade routes. The Parthian Empire's geographical position provided a strategic advantage for controlling long-distance trade networks connecting East Asia, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean world. Situated along the Iranian plateau and adjacent to Mesopotamia, Parthian territory encompassed key transit corridors that formed the early Silk Road. Chinese historical texts from the Han Dynasty, particularly the records of the Grand Historian Shiji and the Book of Han, refer to Parthia as Anshi, highlighting its recognition as a significant intermediary in the exchange of goods between China and the Western Hellenistic world. These records describe diplomatic envoys, gift exchanges, and commercial contacts, illustrating the empire's active role in facilitating transcontinental trade. Caravan routes passing through Parthian lands connected the eastern steppes and Chinese settlements with major urban centers such as Merv, Hekatompelos, and Seleucia. Archaeological surveys of these sites reveal urban infrastructure adapted to long-distance commerce, including fortified caravanserais, granaries, and markets. These settlements functioned as hubs for the storage, taxation, and redistribution of goods. Luxury commodities, including silk from China, spices from India, precious metals, and fine textiles, flowed along these networks, moving westward toward the Mediterranean and returning eastward with Mediterranean products, glassware, and coinage. Control over these corridors allowed the Arsacids to extract revenue through tariffs, tolls, and trade monopolies. Numismatic evidence reinforces the economic importance of these trade routes. Parthian coins circulated widely along Silk Road paths, serving both as currency and symbols of political authority. Coins discovered in Central Asia and Mesopotamia demonstrate standardized weight and metal content, facilitating commerce across culturally diverse regions. The widespread acceptance of Parthian coinage indicates both economic integration and the legitimacy of the Arsacid state in regulating trade. Additionally, inscriptions and administrative records suggest that local governors and elite families participated in the management of trade hubs, collecting revenues and maintaining security for merchants. The economic wealth generated from Silk Road trade supported multiple dimensions of Parthian statecraft. Revenue from trade and taxation enabled the maintenance of infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and fortifications along major routes. These developments facilitated further commercial activity while also enhancing military mobility. The Parthian elite, particularly aristocratic families with regional authority, benefited directly from commercial profits, reinforcing their political influence within the empire. This intersection of economic and political power strengthened the monarchy's position by aligning the interests of local nobles with imperial objectives. Parthian engagement in long-distance trade also had diplomatic implications. Envoys from Han China and other eastern polities traveled along Parthian-controlled routes, establishing formal relations that included gift exchange and negotiation of trade rights. These interactions are documented in Chinese sources and corroborated by Greek and Roman accounts noting Parthian mediation in East-West commerce. Such diplomatic engagement not only facilitated economic exchange but also enhanced the empire's prestige as an intermediary power. Parthia became both a practical conduit for goods and a recognized actor in international relations. The empire's control over trade networks extended beyond raw commerce. Parthians managed the distribution of luxury goods and imposed restrictions to regulate scarcity and value. Archaeological evidence from urban centers, including storage facilities and commercial quarters, indicates organized systems for monitoring shipments and securing valuable cargo. This administrative oversight reflects the integration of economic strategy with state authority, demonstrating that trade was a central component of both political and military planning. Economic strength derived from Silk Road control also underpinned Parthian military capabilities. Revenue allowed for the maintenance of cavalry forces, which were critical for the empire's defense and expansion. These forces required substantial investment in horses, equipment, and training. The mobility afforded by well-maintained roads and logistical networks further amplified the operational effectiveness of Parthian armies. By leveraging trade income, the Ars Acids sustained a military system that could project power over vast and diverse territories without relying on a fixed, large-scale standing army. The concentration of wealth in caravan cities created regional centers of social and cultural exchange. Merchants, artisans, and administrators interacted across linguistic, religious, and ethnic lines, fostering hybrid practices in urban life. Parthian authorities recognized the importance of maintaining stability within these hubs, balancing oversight with local autonomy. Evidence from coins, inscriptions, and material culture demonstrates that while the central monarchy collected revenues, local elites retained substantial operational control, ensuring efficient management while minimizing resistance. By the end of the 1st century BCE, Parthia's dominance over key segments of the Silk Road had established it as a pivotal actor in transcontinental commerce. The combination of strategic geography, administrative oversight, and military protection created a robust economic foundation capable of sustaining the empire's infrastructure and elite networks. The wealth derived from trade not only strengthened internal cohesion but also allowed the Ars Acids to compete with neighboring powers, including Rome and regional Central Asian polities, on both political and military fronts. Control of the Silk Road also shaped broader patterns of economic integration. By regulating the flow of goods between East and West, the Parthians facilitated the movement of technologies, ideas, and cultural practices, reinforcing the processes of cultural synthesis observed in artistic, religious, and administrative spheres. Trade was thus both a source of material wealth and a mechanism for sustaining political authority and cultural cohesion across the empire. Economic power derived from Silk Road control created the conditions for long-term imperial stability. By linking trade, taxation, infrastructure, and military capability, the Ars Acids established a system in which commerce directly reinforced political and military structures. This integration enabled the empire to manage vast distances, diverse populations, and multiple ecological zones effectively. Economic strength enabled military development, particularly the cavalry forces that defined Parthian warfare. The Parthians did not fight like Rome, and that difference changed history. The military strength of the Parthian Empire derived primarily from its cavalry, which combined mobility, precision, and shock power in a manner distinct from the heavy infantry armies of the Mediterranean world. Two forces dominated Parthian tactics: the lightly armored horse archers and the heavily armored cataphracts. Together, these units formed the backbone of an adaptable and highly effective military system, capable of both defense and expansion across diverse terrains. Classical sources, including Plutarch, highlight the operational effectiveness of these troops, particularly during engagements such as the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, where Roman legions were decisively outmaneuvered by mounted Parthian forces. Horse archers represented the core of Parthian tactical doctrine. Equipped with composite bows made from wood, horn, and sinew, these soldiers could deliver sustained volleys of arrows while maintaining high mobility. Their ability to retreat while shooting, later termed the Parthian shot, allowed them to harass and fatigue enemy formations without committing to close combat. Sources describe coordinated maneuvers in which horse archers encircled opposing infantry, exploiting terrain and open plains to maximize their range advantage. Archaeological findings, including arrowheads and depictions on reliefs from sites such as Nisa and Hatra, corroborate the prevalence of mounted archery as a central feature of Parthian military culture. The cataphracts served a complementary role to the horse archers. These heavily armored cavalry units, clad in scale or lamellar armor, were designed for direct shock engagement. Mounted on powerful horses often protected with partial barding, cataphracts functioned as the decisive force capable of breaking enemy lines after an initial phase of missile harassment. Numismatic and artistic depictions illustrate the scale and armor of these units, often showing both rider and horse heavily protected and wielding lances or swords. The coordination of cataphracts with horse archers allowed Parthian commanders to combine sustained missile fire with a concentrated strike, a dual approach that proved difficult for slower, infantry-centric armies to counter. Military organization reflected the decentralized political system of the empire. Aristocratic families, particularly the Surin and Karen clans, provided contingents of cavalry raised from their own estates. Each noble house contributed units according to its resources, integrating local forces into the broader military structure. This system allowed the empire to mobilize significant forces without maintaining a permanent, centrally administered standing army. While this contributed to flexibility and rapid expansion, it also required careful negotiation with noble families to ensure loyalty and coordination, especially during prolonged campaigns or in contested border regions. The effectiveness of Parthian cavalry depended on training, discipline, and coordination. Mounted troops were raised from families with traditions of steppe warfare, maintaining skills in archery, horsemanship, and small unit tactics from an early age. Plato of Greek sources notes that Parthian soldiers demonstrated unusual endurance and maneuverability, able to maintain pressure on opponents over extended periods. The composite bow, with a draw weight exceeding 80 pounds, allowed riders to penetrate armor at ranges beyond the effective reach of standard infantry weapons. Such technological and tactical innovations gave the Parthians a strategic advantage in the open plains of Mesopotamia and the Iranian plateau. The interaction between horse archers and cataphracts demonstrates the adaptation of steppe warfare traditions to imperial contexts. Mobility, harassment, and shock tactics, inherited from nomadic warfare, were integrated with the requirements of governing urban centers and maintaining control over settled populations. Campaigns required logistical planning, including the provisioning of horses, maintenance of bow materials, and coordination across regions. The Ars-Acid monarchy, while decentralized, exercised strategic oversight, ensuring that noble contingents were available for coordinated operations when necessary. Parthian tactical methods proved especially effective against Mediterranean-style armies reliant on disciplined infantry formations. At Carrhae, Roman legions, heavily armed with pila and swords, were unable to withstand repeated volleys from horse archers and the subsequent charges of cataphracts. Plutarch's account emphasizes that Roman commanders were surprised not by the number of Parthians but by their use of mobility, flexible positioning, and the sustained application of missile fire. This engagement highlighted the broader effectiveness of steppe-derived tactics against conventional armies, influencing Roman military strategy in subsequent decades. Archaeological evidence supports these accounts. Excavations at frontier forts and military sites across Mesopotamia and eastern Iran revealed defensive structures designed to accommodate cavalry deployment and training grounds for mounted troops. Reliefs and statuary from Nisa and Hatra depict both horse archers in dynamic stances and cataphracts in formalized combat formations, emphasizing the dual roles of harassment and shock. Material culture, including arrowheads and horse harness fittings, illustrates both technological sophistication and standardized equipment suitable for large-scale deployment. The reliance on cavalry also had implications for empire-wide military logistics. Horses required grazing land, fodder, and veterinary care, necessitating infrastructure to sustain mounted forces. Caravan routes, which facilitated economic trade, also supported military mobility, linking garrison towns and regional centers. Parthian control of strategic points along these corridors ensured both commercial and military security, reflecting the integration of economic and military planning within the imperial system. The strategic flexibility afforded by the cavalry-dominated military structure allowed the Parthians to conduct both offensive and defensive operations across varied terrain. Open plains, river valleys, and steppe regions favored mobility and ranged combat, while urban sieges required coordination with infantry and allied forces from local populations. Classical and archaeological sources demonstrate that Parthian generals adapted their deployment according to environmental and tactical conditions, maintaining cohesion despite the decentralized contributions of noble contingents. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the Parthian military system had established a sustainable model for imperial defense and expansion. The combination of horse archers and cataphracts allowed the Ars Acids to contest territories against both sedentary Hellenistic successors and the rising power of Rome. Decentralized recruitment and noble participation reinforced the political structure while leveraging the empire's human and material resources efficiently. This integration of steppe traditions into imperial warfare became a defining characteristic of Parthian military identity. These tactics would soon be tested in one of the most significant confrontations between East and West. In 53 BCE, Rome marched east and suffered one of its greatest defeats. The confrontation between Parthia and Rome reached a defining moment in 53 BCE when Marcus Licinius Crassus, seeking personal prestige and wealth, led a Roman expedition into eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Crassus commanded approximately 35,000 men, largely composed of heavy infantry legions, supported by light cavalry auxiliaries. His campaign, motivated by the ambition to extend Roman influence into Parthian-controlled territories, underestimated both the capabilities of Parthian forces and the challenges of campaigning in unfamiliar steppe and desert environments. The strategic objective was the capture of the Parthian satrapy of Mesopotamia and, ultimately, a demonstration of Roman supremacy over the eastern frontier. Parthian forces were commanded by the nobleman Surina, whose military acumen and understanding of steppe tactics proved decisive. Surina deployed approximately 10,000 cavalry, including horse archers and cataphracts, in a formation designed to exploit the mobility and ranged capabilities of the Parthian army. The Parthian strategy emphasized harassment and attrition, avoiding direct infantry engagement with the Roman legions initially. Plutarch and other classical sources describe how horse archers executed repeated flanking maneuvers, continuously releasing volleys of arrows while retreating strategically, forcing Roman soldiers to maintain tight formations under sustained pressure. The Romans, trained for close-quarters combat and disciplined in conventional legionary tactics, found themselves at a disadvantage. The composition and maneuverability of the Parthian cavalry neutralized the pila and sword-based offensive strategies that had proved effective against Mediterranean opponents. Roman attempts to pursue the Parthian horse archers were repeatedly frustrated, leaving troops exposed to persistent missile attacks. Sources indicate that the open terrain near Carrhae amplified the Parthian advantage, providing ample space for mounted units to outmaneuver heavy infantry. Cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry, were employed at critical moments to deliver concentrated shock attacks. Once the Roman legions were fatigued and disorganized by continuous missile harassment, the cataphracts charged to break the cohesion of Roman lines. This two-phase combination of harassment followed by decisive shock was a hallmark of Parthian warfare and demonstrated the effective integration of steppe military traditions into large-scale imperial conflict. Contemporary Roman accounts emphasize that the speed, coordination, and tactical innovation of the Parthians were unprecedented in Rome's experience in the eastern frontier. The Roman defeat was compounded by logistical miscalculations. Crassus' forces faced shortages of water and supplies, exacerbated by the mobility of the Parthian cavalry and the lack of secure supply lines. Communication between units was disrupted by Parthian maneuvers, further limiting the Romans' ability to respond to the battlefield dynamics. Historians note that these operational difficulties highlight the challenges of projecting a primarily infantry-based military force across open plains dominated by cavalry. Crassus himself attempted to negotiate with Surinna following initial setbacks, a decision that ultimately proved fatal. According to Plutarch, during the parley, Crassus was killed, and command devolved to subordinate officers who lacked both the authority and the local knowledge to coordinate a cohesive withdrawal. The aftermath saw approximately 20,000 Roman soldiers captured or killed, while surviving forces retreated in disarray. The magnitude of the loss, one of Rome's largest defeats in the Republican era, demonstrated the effectiveness of Parthian military organization and tactics against a major Mediterranean power. The victory at Carrhae had profound implications for Parthian prestige and strategic posture. It confirmed the viability of the Parthian military system, particularly the combination of decentralized noble contributions, cavalry mobility, and integrated missile shock tactics. Roman sources repeatedly emphasize that the Parthians demonstrated an ability to coordinate across multiple units without a rigid command hierarchy, reflecting the adaptive nature of their political and military structures. Archaeological findings, including reliefs and weaponry associated with Parthian forces, corroborate these accounts, illustrating the technological and organizational capabilities that enabled success. In addition to immediate military consequences, the battle influenced subsequent Roman-Parthian relations. Rome recognized Parthia as a formidable Eastern power, prompting diplomatic engagement, intermittent conflict, and eventual negotiated settlements over contested territories in Mesopotamia and Armenia. Classical sources document that Parthian envoys participated in treaties and prisoner exchanges, indicating that while the Parthians maintained military advantage, they also exercised strategic restraint to consolidate gains without provoking unsustainable escalation. The Battle of Carrhae also demonstrated the broader strategic value of cavalry and steppe warfare in imperial contexts. Parthian success relied on the exploitation of terrain, mobility, and missile superiority, illustrating a clear departure from traditional Mediterranean military doctrine. The engagement influenced Roman military reforms in subsequent decades, including adjustments to cavalry deployment, formation flexibility, and combined arms tactics, showing how Parthian methods left a lasting impact on Eastern Mediterranean military thinking. By the end of the engagement, Parthia had not only defended its territory, but had also projected power and deterrence across its western frontier. Surinna's leadership and the performance of Parthian forces confirmed the empire's capacity to resist external pressures, reinforcing internal cohesion and enhancing the legitimacy of the Ars Acid monarchy. The defeat of a major Roman expedition became a defining moment in the historical narrative of Parthian resilience and strategic competence. Despite this decisive victory, relations with Rome remained complex and often unstable. Diplomatic engagement, periodic conflict, and competition over buffer territories such as Armenia continued throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE. The lessons of Carrhae would shape both Parthian military policy and Roman strategic planning, illustrating how a single battle could influence regional power dynamics for decades. At its height, the Parthian Empire rivaled Rome, but struggled within. By the 1st century BCE and into the early 1st century CE, the Parthian Empire had reached its territorial and political zenith. Its borders extended from the Euphrates in the west to the fringes of Central Asia in the east, encompassing diverse ecological zones and cultural regions. Urban centers such as Ctesiphon, Seleucia, and Hekatompelos functioned as political, administrative, and economic hubs, while regional satraps and noble families managed local governance. Parthian control over key trade routes, particularly those connecting Mesopotamia with Central Asia, sustained both imperial wealth and military capability, reinforcing the empire's position as a dominant Eurasian power. Classical sources, including Tacitus and Dio Cassius, describe the Parthians as capable of projecting authority across vast territories, maintaining diplomatic relations, and engaging Rome in a balance of power dynamic rather than outright confrontation. Despite external strength, the internal structure of the empire introduced significant challenges. The decentralized nature of governance, which relied heavily on noble families such as the Surin and Karen clans, allowed for flexibility but also fostered recurring succession disputes. The Ars-Acid dynasty lacked a fixed system of primogeniture, meaning multiple claimants to the throne often emerged upon the death of a ruler. Classical sources, including Tacitus, document instances in which rival branches of the royal family vied for power, occasionally producing civil strife and temporary fragmentation. These internal conflicts limited the central monarchy's ability to enforce consistent policy across the empire, even while projecting military strength outward. Military organization mirrored these internal dynamics. While noble families supplied elite cavalry contingents, competing aristocratic interests sometimes undermined operational cohesion. In periods of dynastic uncertainty, provincial governors and regional magnates could withhold troops or act independently, constraining the emperor's authority. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions and coinage from contested reigns, indicates localized assertions of legitimacy, with multiple claimants minting coins and asserting control over different territories. These patterns illustrate the inherent tension between decentralized power and imperial cohesion during the empire's peak. Roman-Parthian interactions during this period further illustrate the empire's external and internal balance. While the Battle of Carrhae had established Parthian military credibility, subsequent decades involved a combination of diplomacy, proxy conflicts, and occasional skirmishes, particularly over the Armenian buffer states. Tacitus records that Rome and Parthia frequently negotiated settlements, alternating between recognition of Parthian kings and attempts to influence succession in contested regions. The resulting equilibrium highlights the empire's ability to assert influence externally even as internal divisions limited unilateral expansion. The economic foundations of peak Parthian power supported both military and administrative capacity. Control over Silk Road trade allowed the monarchy to collect revenue through taxation, tariffs, and trade monopolies, reinforcing alliances with powerful noble families. Urban centers such as Seleucia and Ctesiphon functioned as hubs for both commerce and administration, integrating populations from diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Archaeological surveys reveal well-planned urban infrastructure, including administrative buildings, marketplaces, and fortified precincts, reflecting the capacity of the empire to manage resources over vast distances. Cultural and religious cohesion also contributed to the empire's relative stability. Despite decentralization, the Ars-Acids promoted a shared imperial identity that combined Iranian traditions with Hellenistic and Mesopotamian elements. Coinage, royal inscriptions, and ceremonial practices emphasized continuity and legitimacy, reinforcing the monarchy's symbolic authority across ethnically and linguistically diverse populations. This symbolic cohesion allowed the empire to absorb new territories and manage trade networks, even as political authority fluctuated in particular provinces. The peak of Parthian power was thus a complex interplay between external projection and internal fragility. Military prowess, economic control, and cultural integration enabled the Ars-Acids to rival Rome, yet succession disputes and the semi-autonomous role of noble families prevented absolute central authority. Classical accounts document that emperors occasionally needed to negotiate with powerful nobles to secure loyalty or military support, reflecting the ongoing negotiation between monarchy and aristocracy. This political model, while effective in certain contexts, created vulnerabilities that could be exploited during periods of internal strife. By maintaining a combination of military strength, economic wealth, and symbolic legitimacy, the Parthians were able to sustain their empire at a high point for several decades. However, historians recognize that the very structures which enabled this success, decentralized noble power, variable succession practices, and reliance on local elites, also planted the seeds of vulnerability. Internal divisions, while manageable during periods of strong leadership, would contribute to recurring instability in subsequent centuries. These dynamics illustrate that peak power is rarely synonymous with uniform strength. The Parthian Empire's external influence, as evidenced by its negotiations and confrontations with Rome, existed alongside persistent internal tensions. Maintaining cohesion across vast territories and diverse populations required constant management, negotiation, and adaptation. By the end of the 1st century CE, while the empire had achieved territorial and political prominence, these structural pressures foreshadowed the challenges that would eventually emerge during the decline of the Arsacid dynasty. Internal divisions would eventually contribute to the empire's decline in 224 CE. A new Persian power ended Parthian rule, but not its legacy. By the early 3rd century CE, the Parthian Empire had entered a prolonged period of internal and external challenges. Succession disputes and factional rivalries among the nobility weakened the central authority of the Arsacid kings, leaving the empire vulnerable to both internal rebellion and foreign pressure. The decentralized political system that had allowed flexibility and local autonomy for centuries now contributed to fragmentation, as regional governors and aristocratic families increasingly acted independently. Classical and Middle Persian sources document repeated conflicts among claimants to the throne, which diverted resources from border defense and undermined the coherence of imperial administration. At the same time, external pressures intensified. Roman-Parthian confrontations over Mesopotamia and Armenia persisted, stretching the empire's military capabilities. While Parthian cavalry tactics remained effective in open battle, repeated engagements drained resources and tested the coordination of noble-led contingents. In addition, frontier regions in the east faced pressures from nomadic groups and emergent Central Asian polities, creating multi-directional threats that compounded internal weaknesses. Archaeological evidence, including disrupted settlements and fortifications in Mesopotamia and eastern Iran, reflects the strain on administrative and military infrastructure during this period. The decisive challenge to Parthian rule came from the rising Sassanid dynasty in southwestern Iran. Ardashir I, previously a local ruler in Persis, consolidated power through both military conquest and political alliances, uniting factions dissatisfied with Arsacid authority. According to Middle Persian and Roman sources, Ardashir defeated Artabanus IV in 224 CE at the Battle of Hormozgan, effectively ending the Arsacid dynasty after nearly 5 centuries of rule. The transition was both military and political. Sassanid forces absorbed key Parthian territories, and the new dynasty established a centralized administrative structure, contrasting sharply with the decentralized governance of the Arsacids. Despite the fall of the Arsacid state, Parthian political and military traditions persisted and influenced the Sassanid Empire. The reliance on cavalry, the integration of noble contingents, and the tactical emphasis on mobility remained central to Persian military doctrine for centuries. Similarly, the Arsacid practice of combining Iranian and Hellenistic cultural elements informed Sassanid art, architecture, and coinage. Urban centers like Ctesiphon continued as administrative and commercial hubs, preserving the spatial and economic infrastructure established under Parthian rule. Archaeological excavations indicate continuity in fortifications, palatial structures, and trade networks, demonstrating that Parthian legacies were foundational for the subsequent imperial system. The Parthian experience also shaped the strategic balance between Rome and Persia. The defensive and offensive capabilities of the Arsacids had forced Rome to adopt a long-term policy of negotiated settlements, proxy warfare, and border diplomacy. This model persisted under the Sassanids, who inherited both the frontier territories and the complex geopolitical framework established by their predecessors. In many respects, Parthia had set the parameters for East-West interaction in the Near East, influencing centuries of Roman-Persian relations. Culturally, the Parthian Empire contributed to the development of a distinct Iranian identity that endured under the Sassanids. Administrative practices, coinage styles, artistic motifs, and religious pluralism provided models for later states. Zoroastrian institutions, already reinforced under Arsacid patronage, became more centralized under the Sassanids, but their earlier Parthian foundations facilitated this process. Similarly, the integration of Hellenistic and local traditions demonstrated a pragmatic approach to ruling a multi-ethnic empire, a pattern that informed Sassanid governance. The fall of Parthia also illustrates the limits of decentralized power in sustaining long-term imperial stability. While the Arsacids successfully managed a multi-regional empire for centuries through aristocratic cooperation and flexible administration, the absence of a strong, standardized succession mechanism ultimately enabled a concentrated challenger like Ardashir to seize control. This pattern highlights a broader historical lesson. Decentralization can allow resilience and adaptability, but may create vulnerabilities when ambitious actors exploit moments of internal weakness. Economically, trade networks and urban infrastructure established under the Parthians continued to function under Sassanid control. Silk Road routes, caravan cities, and riverine trade hubs provided continuity of commerce, revenue, and cultural exchange. Archaeological evidence shows that Seleucia, Ctesiphon, and other key settlements maintained their roles as economic centers, ensuring that the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies across Eurasia persisted despite political transition. By the time of Ardashir's consolidation, the Parthian Empire as a political entity had ended, but its influence on governance, military strategy, and cultural synthesis endured. Parthian methods of combining steppe military tactics with imperial administration, managing diverse populations, and negotiating complex diplomatic relations provided a blueprint for subsequent Iranian states. Furthermore, Rome's experience with Parthian resistance informed centuries of Mediterranean-Persian interactions, demonstrating the long-term geopolitical impact of the Arsacids. In conclusion, while the fall of the Parthian Empire in 224 CE marked the end of Arsacid rule, its structural, military, and cultural legacies continued to shape the ancient Near East. The Sassanids built upon Parthian foundations, preserving key administrative practices, military doctrines, and cultural policies. Long after their political defeat, the Parthians' imprint on regional power dynamics, economic networks, and intercultural exchange remained evident. The legacy of Parthia would continue to shape the ancient world long after its fall. Before we conclude, make sure to hit the subscribe button and click the bell icon so you don't miss any daily Nightfall history videos. Drop a comment below telling us which Parthian moment fascinated you the most. Was it the rise of Arsaces, the legendary Battle of Carrhae, or the empire's enduring legacy? Your thoughts help guide future deep dives into the world's greatest civilizations.